Sheila Kenny. Thank you, Your Honor. Would you state your name, please?
Sheila Kenny.
And Ms. Kenny, how are you employed?
I'm employed at the Center for Death Penalty Litigation in Durham, North Carolina.
Are you a capital defense attorney?
I am.
How long have you served in that capacity?
Since 2001.
And have you been appointed by the Office of Defense Services to represent the court in this case?
Yes, I have.
I've got a lot of documents I want to go through with you, and with the court's permission, if I could just stand up there during the direct.
You may.
Thank you.
You may.
Now, we've got about 3 or 4 beginning on the lay of strong foundation. Now, if you will turn to page 2 of the document, she will put it on the screen. What is on page 2 and page 3 of this document?
On page 2 of the document, there's a list of cases. On the left-hand column indicating which county, Harnett and Johnston, is showing up on page 2. It has the defendant last name, defendant first name, and whether or not the case was capitally tried, and whether or not the case was initially listed on the initial list of capitally tried cases. On continuing on page 3, it has the remainder of Johnston cases and Lee cases.
Okay, let me show you Defendant's Exhibit 17, just the first page for now. What is that?
Yes, and that is a list. The source was a January 13th, 2023 letter from Jonathan Babb with a Bates stamp number, and is a list of just Johnston County cases with a defendant last name and defendant first name.
Is that just an is that just a duplicate of what was in the letter with respect to Johnston County?
That's correct.
The did you review all those cases to indicate that they were capitally tried?
I did.
And in the Defendant's Exhibit 16, did it indicate one was tried capitally that you determined was not tried capitally?
Yes, I did.
And which one was that?
Michael Scott Sisler.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to just mark through Michael Scott Sisler on Defendant's Exhibit 17.
I have done so.
And how did you make that determination?
By reviewing the appellate opinion in State v. Sisler, where it indicates after conviction, the judge, without a sentencing hearing, without a capital sentencing hearing, sentenced Mr. Sisler to life without possibility of parole.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
It's Defendant 19. What is that?
That is a copy of State v. Sisler from the Court of Appeals of North Carolina, 218 NC App 60, 2012.
I would move Defendants 19 into evidence.
Without objection, that's allowed.
Let me show you Defendants 18. What is that?
Excuse me. Defendants 18 is a transcript of proceedings in State v. Michael Scott Sisler from Johnston County. The case came on for trial on March 7, 2011, and it's the first page is a cover page, and it's 7 pages of transcript.
And does that also help verify that it was tried non-capital?
Yes, in that case, it indicated that there is one attorney for the defendant, W. Robert Denning, and in a capital trial, there would be 2.
I would move Defendants 18 into evidence.
Objection.
Now, with respect...
Let it be admitted.
I'm sorry, Judge. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Move on.
Did you... Originally, in that Defendant's Exhibit 16, that was a list of capitally tried cases from the state that the state provided from 1980 forward. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then, after our hearing a couple weeks ago, the judge indicated we could go back to 1970 for a time frame. Is that right?
That's correct.
Did you determine if there were any other capitally tried cases in Johnston County between 1970 and 1980?
Yes.
And what was that?
State v. Rock.
I'm going to object at this time, Your Honor, to relevance. I think, just to give a forecast for the court, we're talking about these cases that were sentenced capitally in Johnston County at this point. And I don't think that Ms. Kenny is going to be in the position to talk about, I think, as a forecast for the court, that the defense is going to call a statistician, Dr. Richard Smith, to talk about an analysis that he performed on this list that we're talking about now of capitally tried cases in Johnston County. And I believe where we're going with this is that the defense would like to admit all of these associated court documents with this list of cases. And I don't believe that Ms. Kenny, who has been actively involved in this litigation representing this defendant, is going to be able to lay that foundation because she did not actually perform the analysis, the sentencing analysis. There's going to be no expert testimony about that. And so before we get into this quite voluminous collection of documents, the state is objecting at this time, at this point, on the basis of relevance and foundation and authenticity.
Is it during the time period that I have indicated is relevant?
I'm sorry, is what during the time period?
The cases.
The cases are during the time period that the court has deemed relevant, but this witness did not perform any kind of analysis or study or any of the opinions that are going to be testified about regarding these cases. And the expert didn't review them either.
I'll note your advanced heads up for the court.
Yes, sir.
But, I don't know what it is.
Yes, sir.
So, go ahead, proceed.
Ms. Kenny, you're not going to offer any opinions with respect to anything here today, are you?
No, I am not.
I believe the question posed to you was something along the lines of, did you make a determination if there were any cases pre-1980 tried capitally in Johnston County?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
State v. Robert Henry McDowell.
Let me hand you what is marked as Defense Exhibit 20.
Yes, I have it.
And what is that?
That's McDowell v. Dixon. It's the Fourth Circuit.
Hold on 1 second.
The Fourth Circuit opinion from 1988.
And does it, in that opinion, does it indicate when he was convicted?
Yes.
And was that prior to 1980, but in the modern death penalty era?
Yes, on December 10th, 1979. That's on the first page of the opinion.
And does the opinion also indicate the defendant's race?
It does.
And does the opinion indicate that he received a death sentence?
Yes, it does.
And does the opinion also indicate where the county of origin for the case?
It indicates that he was convicted in Johnston County.
Thank you. Your Honor, I admit Defendant's Exhibit 20 into evidence.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Defendant's Exhibit number 20.
Now, if you would go back to Defendant's Exhibit 17 and just add at the bottom Mr. McDowell's name.
I don't have you offered 17 yet.
I've not offered yet because you wouldn't let me write on it then, I don't think.
It's up to you.
I have done so.
Okay, now, did you make, with that list on Defendant's Exhibit 17, did you pull public court documents to determine the race of all those defendants?
I did so.
And did you pull court documents to indicate the sentence of each of those defendants?
Let me clarify. I did, except with respect to the case we've just added, Robert Henry McDowell.
And on that one, what did you rely on?
I relied on the court opinion.
And did you make a summary chart of all the documents that you relied upon to document the race of each defendant and the sentence of each defendant?
I did so.
Let me show you. You're familiar with the exhibits 22 through 102?
I am.
And have you reviewed all of those exhibits?
I have.
And are the exhibits, defendants 22 through 102, the documents you relied upon in making these determinations as to race and result of each of these cases?
Yes.
And do these documents also show the time of the trial?
Yes.
Based on defendants exhibits 22 through 102, did you prepare a summary chart for the court?
I did.
Let me show you what's marked as defendants exhibit 21.
Thank you.
What is that?
Defendant's Exhibit 21 is the spreadsheet I created based on the documents referenced and also based on the list of cases provided by the state.
Were you able to document the race of all the defendants?
Yes, I was.
There was one that hasn't asked us. Can you tell us about that one?
Yes. I was looking at court documents for race. I looked at arrest warrant and the judgment and commitment. I did also, because it was an available source that I was reviewing, was the Department of Adult Corrections, which also has a page for each individual in the DAC, and I also had looked at that. The arrest warrant and judgment and commitment for Johnny Daughtry indicates white, and I had just marked it with an asterisk merely because the Department of Adult Corrections website had indicated he was Native American. So just for clarity, I noted that.
Have all the documents, defendants exhibits 22 through 102, been provided to the state?
Yes.
As well as your summary chart?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would ask to admit defendants exhibit 21 into evidence.
Objection may be heard, Your Honor.
You may. Briefly.
Your Honor, under Rule 1006, this would not be admissible in that case. Well, there is a case called Coman, C-O-M-A-N, versus Thomas Manufacturing Company. That's 105, NC App 88. That's a 1992 case where the Court of Appeals ruled that a summary was properly excluded from evidence if it does not fairly represent the underlying document. And in addition, under Rule 901, this has not been properly authenticated in Brown versus City of Winston-Salem, which is 176 North Carolina Act 497. That's a 2006 case. In that case, Your Honor, the petitioners they were challenging the city annexation ordinance, and the trial court properly ruled that the spreadsheets could not be offered to show the city's methodology, which was not calculated to provide accurately reasonable results because they presented no expert testimony about the spreadsheets, and testimony of the city's principal planner was insufficient to establish the foundation for admissibility under Rule 901. And obviously, Your Honor, something has to be authenticated to be admitted. And again, this is going back to my earlier point, the defense they're going to have Richard Smith testify about a sentencing, an analysis on sentencing on this list of cases. And so which he did not review any of these underlying documents for. So Ms. Kenny's testimony, who is actively representing this defendant in this litigation, her testimony is insufficient to authenticate any of these materials such that they're admissible because she didn't rely on them, nor did their expert in conducting this analysis with regards to the sentencing. And specifically with regards to Defendants 21 with the sentencing chart, there was some debate about, and I believe if you can see the sentence underneath the chart where it refers to Mr. Daughtry's case, it says that the DAC website lists his race as American Indian, Alaskan Native, and that's different from the race that's actually listed in the chart that their statistician looked at. So that's just one example of the inconsistency now we have between this data that they're going to be presenting expert testimony on and this data that's being admitted. So it's absolutely confusing for the court. It's confusing for the record. It's not been properly authenticated under Rule 901. It's not admissible under Rule 1006. It all becomes hearsay, and it's not relevant at this point because there hasn't been sufficient testimony to authenticate it. So we'd ask the court to exclude it at this time.
I'm glad to let you ask a few questions of the witness as to the issues that you allege.
Yes, Your Honor.
Briefly.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Kenny, you didn't perform any of the sentencing analysis in this case, did you?
No, I did not.
And you're aware that your expert witness that you hired in this case performed an analysis on the list of performed an analysis on the list of cases that we've just been talking about here, right?
Yes.
And you're aware that he didn't review any of these documents, right?
Yes.
And you have gone and pulled this information from different sources to put together this spreadsheet, correct?
I pulled information from court files, and the universe would be arrest warrant, judgment and commitment, issues and recommendations form as to punishment, and then the appellate opinion. In addition, I also looked at the Department of Adult Corrections. The arrest warrant and the judgment and commitment were used for race, and the source of the date of crime was the judgment and commitment. The source of the date of sentence was the judgment and commitment. Additional source of the date of sentence was the issues and recommendation as to punishment and a court opinion.
So we're up to 7 or 8 different sources for all this information, right?
No. I would say judgment and commitment, arrest warrant, issues and recommendation form as to punishment, appellate opinion, and not on the spreadsheet, but I noted it, was as the Department of Adult Corrections.
So 5 different sources of information for all of this information in this multi-column, multi-row spreadsheet.
Again, the judgment and commitment addresses race, date of crime, date of sentence, and then additional sources merely to confirm, to always make sure that I was confirming it, use the issues and recommendation form, arrest warrant, appellate opinion.
And so you would acknowledge that the race for Johnny Daughtry, which Dr. Smith used for his analysis that he will be presenting on, is different from the one that is now indicated in this spreadsheet. Right? You acknowledge that?
I can't acknowledge that because I'm not sure what you're pointing to or which race you're referencing. I'm sorry.
The line at the bottom of Defendant's Exhibit 21, could you read it?
Yes.
Hadn't she already talked about this?
Yes.
Isn't this the one that she talked about?
Yes, Your Honor.
I talked about it, but I was asking her questions about it.
No, Mr. Ferguson has already asked her about this, right?
Yes,
I don't
Your Honor.
believe so.
Yes, I do.
Yes, he did. I have in my notes there was an asterisk due to one being saying it was white, but he was actually Native American. I've got that. Is that what you're asking again?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, move on.
Yes, Your Honor.
And let me ask you this. How long has the state had this information?
Your Honor, this was actually produced to us about 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
I think
it's
it's
a small list. Do you have evidence that any of it's incorrect?
Besides that one inconsistency?
Yeah, well, that's explained already. Besides that, do you have any evidence that it's not correct?
Your Honor, the additional 200 documents that were produced at the same time that the summary chart was produced about 2 weeks ago.
Ma'am, that's not my question. It's a simple document. It says what their races are. That's why we're here. Do you have any evidence that those 20 lines or whatever they are incorrect?
Now, besides that one inconsistency between...
Your objection's overruled. The document is admitted. It is simply her methodology of gathering from judgments and commitments that we all rely on. I think that's a spurious objection. Let's move on and get this stuff going, okay? All right, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Let me show you what's marked as Exhibit 354. I'm sorry. 354. What is that, please?
This is an email from Jay Ferguson to Jonathan Babb, dated February 20th, 2024.
And does it indicate I was going to be asking to move this documented evidence pursuant to Rule 1006?
Yes. It indicates we intend to introduce the attached summary chart pursuant to Rule 1006 at the hearing. The supporting documents have been disclosed and are listed in the attached Excel document. If you believe you don't have any of those documents, please let me know so you can review them prior to our proffer of the summary chart.
Now, back to Defendant's Exhibit 21.
What number was that you just said? 3-something?
354. I would move 354 into evidence, Your Honor.
Let 354 be admitted into evidence.
Ms. Stubbs. That's all, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right. Is that all for this witness?
No. I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Yes.
May I move? I'll put out one thing.
Yeah.
On Defendant's Exhibit 17, did you then, on the second page of Defendant's Exhibit 17, did you note the race of each of the defendants? What is the second page of Defendant's Exhibit 17?
Defendant's Exhibit 17, page 2, is the state's list, which is on page 1 of Defendant's Exhibit 17, adding the race of the defendant, the sentence information, and the sentence year in columns 3, 4, and 5.
And did you, from the chart in Defendant's Exhibit 21, just put on Defendant's Exhibit 17 the race and the sentence and the year of the sentence?
Yes, with the exclusion of Mr. McDowell.
Okay, could you please write Mr. McDowell's name on page 2? And again, if you would please mark out Mr. Sisler.
I have marked out Mr. Sisler and I've added Robert McDowell.
So to your knowledge, based upon the state's letter to us listing the Johnston County cases, is page 2 of Exhibit 17, a complete list of the capital trial cases in Johnston County cases with the race of the defendant, sentence information, and sentence year.
Can you repeat the question?
Is page
Is it a
2?
complete list of Johnston County cases
Yes.
as revised?
Yes, provided by the state's list. Yes, Your Honor.
I'll move defendant's Exhibit 17 into evidence.
Do you care to be heard further?
Just note the objection, Your Honor.
All right. The defense exhibit number 17 is hereby admitted into evidence.
Your Honor, just to be clear, the defense hasn't moved to admit the 20 through 200, have you?
No, and I don't intend to, since it's on the chart.
Okay.
I've got it. I've brought a copy. You need another one?
22 through 102?
Right,
Yes.
and I just want to clarify that, so those have not been admitted and they haven't, so.
So I'm admitting exhibit 17 as revised. And are you offering 21 at this time, the spreadsheet?
Yes, Your Honor. I thought you would rule on that. I'm sorry.
Well, I think I did, but it is hereby admitted.
More esteemed counsel has indicated I need to move defendant's exhibits 22 through 102 into evidence.
Okay.
And the state would object at this time, Your Honor.
They are compilations of court documents.
They're.
I'm asking him.
Court document, the same document she read.
Right.
Every document that's on that chart is here.
Is here, and what is here?
I'm sorry. May I approach, Your Honor?
Well,
They are
what is here?
warrants for
Court documents?
Court documents, DAC information, appellate opinions.
Okay, and have you served this on the state?
Yes.
Okay, how long ago?
Most of it was provided discovery. I'd say about 25% was disclosed on February 5th, and then we gave them
25%.
I'm not sure.
And are most of them public records?
Yes, all of them.
Okay, all right. What is your objection?
Well, Your Honor, I don't think there's been any foundation that any of these are public records. I don't think they've been properly authenticated since the court didn't even know what they were. But that would be the objection.
Well, we do know what they were because she's testified as to where she got the information. And she said she got it from the court records.
But Your Honor, it's not relevant at this point because she didn't do any analysis of these documents. Their expert did an analysis and he did not review them. And they're going to offer conclusions about them.
They're public records that anybody can go look at, and anybody can make a list of the race, the date of the crime, the date of the sentence. This is not a problem from an evidentiary standpoint for the court. So your objections are all overruled. I mean, let's just get to the meat of the matter, the heart of the matter. We're here, and they're all allowed. Number 21 and number 22 through 102.
That concludes my direct on. Thank you.
All right, on cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Kenny, good morning. You have been representing Mr. Bacot in this litigation thus far, correct?
That's correct.
And you've been sitting at the table actively the past 2 days, correct?
That's correct.
And you testified about how you've reviewed these documents and you've compiled, you testified that you compiled the spreadsheet that has now been admitted into evidence as defendants 21, I believe. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And you compiled that information using all of the sources that you listed, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And you have acknowledged that that is inconsistent with at least one race of the one defendant that we've discussed is inconsistent with what was reported to your expert that he did his analysis on, correct?
Could you repeat the question?
You have acknowledged earlier in your testimony that there is an inconsistency with regards to race with at least one defendant that is listed in the list that your expert relied on, and between your spreadsheet and the expert's list.
The arrest warrant and the judgment of commitment, which were from the court file, indicate that Mr. Johnny Daughtry is listed as white. On the Department of Adult Corrections, not from a court file, indicates that Mr. Daughtry's race listed as Native American. The court file documents indicated white.
And so the list that your expert relied on in his sentencing analysis lists Mr. Daughtry's race as white, right?
I can't speak to that. I'm not looking at anything.
May I approach? Does that appear to be the list that your expert relied upon?
On page 2 of this document you've handed me, where it has the state's list, is the list of cases on my spreadsheet, admitted as Exhibit 21, which does not include Mr. Sisler.
Right. And this is, you just said that was the state's list, right? But on page 1, you have the defense list, right? That says defense list, doesn't it, Ms. Kennedy?
It says defense list.
And it lists Mr. Daughtry, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And for his race, it lists white, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And in your spreadsheet, you have a note where DAC actually reported his race as Alaskan, Indian, or Native American, right? So that's inconsistent.
Again, the arrest warrant and the judgment of commitment as listed on Defense Exhibit 21 listed as white. Department of Adult Corrections listed him as Native American.
So they list him as two different races?
No, Department of Adult Corrections lists him as Native American. Court records, the court file, lists him as white.
So they are indicated differently in the report that in the list that your expert looked at and other records.
Can you repeat that?
They are listed differently in the report that your expert considered and other records.
When you're saying they, what do you mean by they? They are?
The race is listed differently in the report that your expert considered versus other records, correct?
Yes, the
No
race.
Questions, Your Honor.
And the state of North Carolina prepared all those records that they were wrong. Is that correct? If they were wrong. In other words, they're all documents generated by the state.
And my understanding, Your Honor, is that the court file, right, which has the arrest warrant and the judgment commitment, is in the court file. Department of Adult Corrections is on their website.
They're all the state, though, aren't they?
Correct, Your Honor.
I have one additional question.
Sure.
In Defendant's Exhibit 16, the letter that was admitted, Jonathan Babb's letter, doesn't that letter state that that was an inconclusive list?
Yes, I read from the letter.
Right. And it's inconclusive because there is no uniform system in the state of North Carolina to keep track of specifically capitally tried cases, right?
That's what the letter said.
No further questions.
All right.
Very quick redirect, Your Honor. Was the state under a court order from this court to provide us a list of all cases that they knew were tried capitally in Johnston County?
Yes.
And was that letter in response to that court order?
Yes.
That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's go to McCall's witness.
Your Honor, the defendant calls Dr. Richard Smith.
Do you solemnly swear the testimony that you're about to give to the court to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
Good morning, Your Honor.
If you would, make sure you speak into the microphone.
Yeah, can everybody hear me?
Hear you.
Thank you.
You've been sworn. You may examine the witness.
Good morning, Dr. Smith. Can you tell us where you work?
I'm a professor of statistics at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
And where did you do your education?
My first degree was from Oxford University in mathematics, and then I did a PhD in operations research at Cornell University.
And how long have you been teaching, approximately?
Well, ever since I got my PhD, so 45 years, give or take a year or so.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
No.
Thank you.
Your Honor, I'm going to be asking Dr. Smith about what have been marked as Defendant's Exhibits 103 to 106. These are all in the binder that we provided the court yesterday, Volume 2.
Under what tab?
They're under the tab beginning 103.
Thank you.
Yes. So, Dr. Smith, what is this document that I've handed you?
This is my CV.
And, Your Honor, at this time we move for admission of Dr. Smith's CV.
Without objection, the CV, Dr. Smith.
And Dr. Smith, looking here at the first page of your CV, I see that there are a number of honors listed. We won't go over all of them, but can you describe for us a few of these honors and what they mean?
Well, the most recent one here is, excuse me, I'm a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. That's an association that covers science in all areas, and each year they elect a certain proportion of people as fellows. Earlier I was awarded the Distinguished Service Award from the North Carolina chapter of the American Statistical Association, ASA, we'll abbreviate it. I'm also a fellow of the ASA. That's a distinction that is conferred on many statisticians. They, according to the rules of the ASA, they can only elect 1/3 of 1% of their members to fellowship of each year. Earlier I was a fellow of the IMS, the Institute of Mathematical Statistics. That is the other major statistics society that is active in the United States. I'm also an elected member of the International Statistical Institute. That's not indicated on this list, but that's also something you have to be elected to. The J. Stuart Hunter Lecture of the International Environmetric Society is actually a part of the International Statistical Institute, and they recognize people who have made contributions to environmental statistics, which is my main area of research.
And Dr. Smith, I'm going to, with the court's permission, I'm going to approach and hand you what's been marked as Defendant's Exhibit 106.
Thank you.
And Dr. Smith, are these 106 copies of slides that you've prepared for your testimony today?
Yes.
To aid in your testimony?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned that your main area of research is in environmental statistics. Is that right?
Yes.
Specifically, what have been your main? Can you tell us a little bit more about your research areas?
Well, I started out as a mathematical statistician, and many of my research papers are essentially papers in theoretical mathematics. particularly in an area known as extreme value theory, which is concerned with probability and statistics problems where you get extreme values. This is very widely used today in looking at things like extreme climate events. Later on, I became more interested in more the applied side. When I moved to North Carolina, I started working with researchers at the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and through my EPA contacts, they started to get me involved in the question of what are the health effects of air pollution, and so that became a second area of research that I've been working on and off for the past 30 years.
And what courses do you teach at the university?
Well, I teach courses. The courses I teach these days are theoretical and applied statistics. In particular, I teach the first, or at least I have taught this last year. I've taught the first year graduate course, which is about linear models or regression analysis, as we're going to talk about later. I also teach a couple of undergraduate courses. Right now I'm teaching an introductory course in statistics, and I also teach an advanced undergraduate course which covers the topics of generalized linear models and random effects analysis, both of which I think we're going to talk about.
And Dr. Smith, have you looked at applications outside? I know you mentioned that you've been doing work on air pollution and climate change. Can I ask you about an applied area of research that might be a little more intuitive for some of us? Could you talk specifically about your work on running and statistics?
Well, I got interested in this as a statistical problem. I became interested in this in the 1980s. I was applying extreme value theory to the analysis of athletic records. Questions like, to what extent are athletic records improving in time, and how could you predict future evolution of athletic records? More recently, I've worked as an informal, unpaid consultant to the Boston Marathon. They've asked me to give them advice on the questions of qualifying standards for the Boston Marathon, and I've published a couple of papers in that theme.
And turning now to the papers that you've published, approximately how many papers have you published?
I don't have an exact count in my head, but it's certainly over 100.
And have these papers been peer-reviewed?
The majority of them have been peer-reviewed. My CV actually does contain a mark to indicate which ones are peer-reviewed. But I mean, just to be clear for the audience, that peer review refers to when you submit a paper to a professional journal and it gets reviewed by other researchers before it gets published. That's what she means by peer review.
And have you published both on kind of the applications as well as papers on statistical methods?
Yes.
And you mentioned earlier some of the areas of research on methods that you've done. Have you looked at Bayesian methods and hierarchical models?
These are all methods that I've looked at and used at different points in my research, yes.
And what about research that looks at time and how to consider time and data sets?
Well, time series analysis is a recognized subject of statistics. It applies, in fact, the work I did back in the 1980s about athletic records treated the athletic records as a time series because they are correlated from one year to the next. But also in epidemiology and looking at health effects of air pollution, there's a particular class of methods called time series methods that are used in that literature.
And Dr. Smith, we did not go through your more than 100 publications, but they are listed here on pages 11 through 18 of your CV. Is
that seems to be about right, yes.
Dr. Smith, have you ever testified before? as an expert witness?
I have testified in court once before, yes. Well, twice, but twice in the same case.
And were you admitted as an expert statistician in that case?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, we tender Dr. Smith as an expert in statistics.
All right. Feel care to be heard? State. Thank you. All right. Let the record reflect the defendant is hereby accepted as an expert in statistical analysis.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Now, Dr. Smith, I asked you to look at two separate data sets. One was a list of cases about defendants who had been sentenced in capital trials in Johnston County, and one about the Michigan State University jury selection study. Is that right?
That's correct.
I'd like to start this morning with the work that you did on the Johnston County jury sentencing.
Yes.
Can you tell us, well, first, did I give you a list of cases that I described as the state's list of cases?
Yes.
And based on that, did you look to see whether there was a statistically significant difference between the rate that white individuals and black individuals were sentenced to death in Johnston County?
Yes.
And to be clear, Dr. Smith, you did not yourself independently verify the accuracy of this list.
No, I did not.
And how did you go about doing this analysis of determining whether the difference observed was statistically significant?
So the first thing I did was to compile the information I took from the individual cases and compiled a table, the table you see on your screen. This is known to statisticians as a two-way table or a 2x2 table. We classify the cases according to two different criteria. One is the race of the defendant, either black or white, and the other is the sentence, which in these cases was either life in prison and death. So, for instance, in this table, the top left-hand entry is a 0. That means that of the black defendants who were in this case study, none of them were sentenced to life in prison, and in fact, all 6 were sentenced to death. And conversely, for the white defendants in this data set, there were 12 in total. 7 of them were sentenced to life in prison, and 5 were sentenced to death.
And Dr. Smith, then how did you test to see whether this difference was statistically significant?
So there are a number of tests that are used, but one very common test, which I think is the most applicable for this situation, is something known as Fisher's exact test. It's named after a very famous statistician by the name of R.A. Fisher, who was active about 100 years ago, and he developed an exact method of calculating the p-value for this kind of situation. And the null hypothesis in this case is that there is no association between the race of the defendant and the sentence. And I performed Fisher's exact test, and the result of Fisher's exact test was that I rejected that null hypothesis with a p-value of 0.038.
And what conclusion did that allow you to draw about the evidence?
Well, the standard that is most commonly used for p-values is that a p-value of less than 0.05 is considered statistically significant. So I would interpret that as meaning strong evidence against the null hypothesis.
And Dr. Smith, did you prepare a slide to explain for us exactly what the Fisher exact test is doing?
I can explain to you exactly how that Fisher exact test is calculated, yes.
All right.
So we use something called an EARN model. The idea here is how would we hypothetically represent a totally random assignment of the sentences to the white and black defendants. So just think of this as a conceptual model. We have some big urn, and each urn contains either a white ball or a black ball, depending on the race of the defendant, and assume that each defendant has one marked ball in that urn. Now, we saw in that case, in fact, 7 of the defendants were sentenced to life in prison, and the rest of them were all sentenced to death. So imagine we are just picking out the life sentences by just randomly drawing balls from this urn and saying the people who we draw will then get life sentences and the rest will get death. So we're fixing both the number of white defendants and the number of black defendants, and we're fixing the total number of life sentences. It's purely a case of how are these sentences distributed between the white and black defendants. So if we advance the table, thank you. The top left-hand table here shows the actual distribution with 0 life sentences for the black defendants and so on. If you simply write out a list of what are all the possible tables under the constraints I just described, if we fix the number of black and white defendants and we fix the number of life and death sentences, then the other 6 tables here are the other tables that we might have got. Now, those 7 tables, they won't all have the same probability because they represent, some of them clearly represent a more uneven distribution than others. But under this urn model, we can theoretically calculate the probabilities of each of those outcomes. And for the specific one, the one that's labelled observed on the slide, we calculate a probability of 0.0249. Now, that is not actually the p-value, because the definition of a p-value is that you look at the probability of the observed outcome and anything more extreme than the observed outcome. So this is a two-sided test. It's designed to capture the situation where also possibly the whites might be the ones who are more frequently sentenced to death. So if you look at the other tables in that chart, the last 2, the one with red numbers on the probability, those are actually 2 cases that are more extreme than the one we observed with the real data. One has a probability of 0.0124 and the other has a probability of 0.0004. So the p-value is actually that you add up those 3 numbers, which to the 4 decimal places I've been quoting is 0.0377. What I actually said on the previous slide, I just rounded off to 3 decimal places, 0.038.
And just to go back to that slide, this is what you were referring to.
That's what I'm referring to, yes.
Now, Dr. Smith, when you made this calculation here, initially, before you did the illustration for us of how it works, did you calculate this by hand? Or how did you calculate it?
Well, initially, the way I got the answer, the p-value for Fisher exact test, Fisher's exact test is something that is included in every statistical package. It's certainly included in SPSS and SAS and Stata and so on. I was using the R programming language. And there is a function called Fisher.test in R, and I simply plugged the numbers into R, and it gave me the answer 0.038.
And can you just tell us a little bit about what R is?
R is a programming language that is it's a program that you can run on a PC or an Apple or any standard computer machine. It's a freely available program. We all use it very widely in our courses. The courses I was just describing, when you asked me what courses I teach, all of those courses use R as a programming language to teach students how to do those computations in practice.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Now approach the court.
Dr. Smith, I'm going to ask you to do some new calculations based on the testimony from this morning.
Thank you.
I'm handing you a pen. Now, this and a piece of paper, this 2x2 table.
The state's going to object at this time.
I've got some paper.
You got something to put it on here?
Well, I can balance it here, I think.
Go ahead.
I've got a pen.
The state has objected. Did you want me to proceed, Your Honor?
Your Honor, we've had lots of expert deadlines in this case. We've had lots of discovery back and forth about expert reports. The initial disclosure dates for expert reports were, I believe, October, November, December.
Your objection is him doing something here you haven't seen it, right?
We're doing new calculations.
Let's just stay that over. What are you attempting to do?
Your Honor, the state has been under this obligation to produce the state's list. We gave the state's list to Dr. Smith, and that's the slide that he testified based on.
What are you going to ask him to do?
I'm going to ask
now.
I'm going to ask him to remove the one person. There was a white person there who was not actually capitally tried. He's showing up as a life in prison. So, in other words,
So, is this in response to her argument that it was inadmissible?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were asking me what Dr. Smith is going to do.
That's exactly what I asked you. He said he was going to remove one of the persons who was listed as white but was actually Native American. No?
No, Your Honor.
Well, tell me again then.
Okay. So this table right here is based on the state's list. This morning we heard testimony from Ms. Kenny that there were two things on the state's list that have changed. One is that the state's list, they identified a case as capitally tried that in fact was not capitally tried.
Okay.
And then second, there is another case that was from 1979 of a black defendant who was sentenced to death. So I'm going to ask Dr. Smith to remove one white from life in prison and to add one death, one black. I'm going to ask him to just make the small change and then to show us what the Fisher's exact test is.
Your objection is?
Your Honor, at this point, so Ms. Stubbs has now pointed out, I think, more inconsistencies in the data here. And so now we're doing new calculations again. This expert has had this list since the memo that he received the list says he received it back in September 5th of 2023 is when he received this list. So now today, because of these errors that have now been pointed out, the defendant is trying to have him do new calculations based on, and to come to new conclusions in this courtroom based on data that they've had for years. And this is not.
You would agree that having now identified two items of information that he relied on, and that being different, that the calculations need to be redone, wouldn't you? And in order to be accurate.
I don't know. I think that.
But just on a theoretical basis, just on an approach, if we all discover that two things that we thought were true are not true, it changes the data set, and the data set can be recalculated to reflect those changes. Is that correct?
Right. So multiple errors that have now been identified.
And we have two, right?
I don't know at this point.
We have two. That's what we've identified so far. Am I correct?
Yes, and to be clear, one is an error that the state made by calling a case capitally tried when it was in fact not capitally tried. Right. And one is the addition of a new case because of Your Honor's ruling that the time period is from 1970. of course, North Carolina began retrying capital cases in 77.
Your expert is available to receive this data and calculate that in their opinions?
I don't know.
Well, why not?
Well, because it's coming up in trial today. I mean,
I'm not talking about what's coming up in trial. I'm asking you, who is your statistical expert that you're going to present that would counter this testimony?
Dr. Lee.
Okay. So Dr. Lee is available, obviously. Is she in the courtroom?
She is.
Okay, good. Objection overruled. Where's Dr. Lee? All right, Dr. Lee, can you see us and can you see the information and can you
Yes, I can.
okay, and do you need to get somewhere that you can write or that you need to access a computer or anything to follow along and to hear and understand exactly what's going on in this request to delete or change based on these two changes?
Oh, I could, but in this case, I like it to change I'm saying there were some numbers that change, and I'll trust Dr. Smith's calculation because it's a pretty standard calculation.
All right, thank you very much. Objection overruled. All right, you may proceed.
So, Dr. Smith, using the paper, could you just make a new 2x2 table? And then what would you need? I'm going to hand to you now at this time a laptop so that you can use R to do what you've testified about running the Fisher's exact test.
Okay, so maybe we should agree first what exactly the revised table is. Could you please go over again what the two corrections were?
Yes, so using State's Exhibit, Defense Exhibit 17.
Yes.
There is the removal of one life sentence case.
That's a life sentence for a white defendant. So the 7 goes down to a 6.
That's correct.
Okay.
And there is the addition of a black defendant case.
Right.
That is Mr. McDowell, and on the exhibit, he is listed as black.
And his sentence was what?
Death.
So I'm increasing. So the black death count goes from 6 up to 7.
Correct.
Okay. So the table I'm now analysing in the same format as written on the screen. Instead of 0675, I'm analysing 0765.
That's correct.
Okay, so if you would like to pass me the laptop, I will be happy to make that calculation. And I haven't seen this before. I have no idea what's going to come out. Okay, thank you. The p-value is 0.03771.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Okay. Laptop so that we can look at it.
So just quickly, Dr. Smith, it just added an additional 1 in the 10,000th column or so.
In fact, if I may make a comment, the table I just analysed is actually the same as the table on the screen. We've just switched the numbers 6 and 7. When I got that p-value out, my first reaction was, how on earth is exactly the same number? And the reason is because I'm actually analysing the same table. It's just been transposed.
You may ask a question.
At this time, Dr. Smith, can you tell us what we're looking at on the screen here?
Well, okay, I see. This is the code I just typed for you. So would you like me to explain what I did?
Yes. And first, can you tell us just what this screen is?
So this is just a screenshot from R. I mean, you open up RStudio, which is the most commonly used version of R, and you know the stuff at the top of the screen, R version 4.3.2, etc. That's what you get anytime you open up R, and then the line that begins A equals matrix. That's what I typed in.
And is the 2x2 table that you described, does that appear here?
So I just typed in that first line there with the numbers 0765 and the number A that comes out. That actually is the transpose, but I didn't realize at the time I was entering that it was actually the same matrix as for the earlier data set. But Fisher's exact test, it doesn't make any difference if you switch the order of the rows and columns. So, shall I continue?
Yes.
The next line, I typed in Fisher.test brackets A. That's the function that computes Fisher's test for this example. And there are a few different numbers that come out of it, but the one that we're focused on is the one that says p-value equals 0.03771.
Now,
p-value equals 0.03771.
Now, Dr. Smith, I'm going to, may I approach again, Your Honor? Dr. Smith, I'm handing you a copy of your slide where I've indicated I've added one and I've subtracted one. Can you compare that with the table that you just ran?
I can confirm what you just gave me is the same. Oh,
Show her that one.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
You understand what she did, though?
No.
You need to hear her?
Yeah.
So you changed the numbers.
To match what the new evidence was about the state's information being wrong.
Just make the objection to the record.
Objection to what? My comment or to the document?
These additional, if he's going to do new analysis on now these.
He's already done it. This is it.
No, I think she's asking him to do something. She's asking him to do something new with these changes that you've just written on this paper messed up.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. One moment. Yeah.
No, that's exactly what he testified previously the changes were.
So she's just now noting the changes on the paper.
Yeah,
Okay.
what he's already told us.
Okay.
She's just placing it on because of the changes that have been revealed this morning in this morning's testimony. Okay.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor? May I?
Yes. All right. And I want to make sure, Mr. Chesson, that your witness is allowed when his scene is changed. Okay? So if you need her beside you to explain these things to you, I'll be glad to put a chair beside you.
No need, John. Thank you.
All right. All right, you might proceed.
And Dr. Smith, if you look at the matrix here, is that exactly the same as the paper table version that I just handed to you? Can you carefully review that?
Except for the fact that the rows and columns are interchanged, but that makes no difference to the test.
Okay. At this time, I want to turn now to actually, and based on this analysis, is it your opinion that race was statistically significant in jury sentencing in Johnston County?
Yes.
Dr. Smith, now I'd like to turn to your report and analysis of the Michigan State jury study. Did you write a report in this case?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Okay.
Dr. Smith, I've handed you what's been marked as Defendant's Exhibit 104. Is this a copy of your report from October based on the Michigan State data?
Yes, it is.
And Your Honor, this again is in your binder under tab 104. Can you tell us what your central question analyses that you performed and conclusions were?
So this report was my reanalysis of the Michigan State data. There were three main components to it. The first was to review the Michigan State analysis itself, and in particular to verify the tables. There are 13 tables included in numerical tables included in their report that were the results of their statistical analysis, and I was asked to replicate those results successfully. The second analysis I did was an independent analysis of the effect of black on strike. This was particularly focused on the variable selection issue, namely which of the covariates to include in the logistic regression analysis, which we heard about yesterday from Dr. O'Brien. And I concluded that the overall conclusion that there's a statistically significant effect due to the race of the juror is a statistically significant result under all of those alternative analyses. And the third part of my analysis was the variation of the odds ratio with time. This was particularly focused on the question that Mr. Bacote was sentenced in, or was tried in April 2009, and I was asked to come up with an estimate for what the strike rate ratio was as of 2009.
Now, before we go turn to those findings and analyses in more detail, can you just take a step back and explain for us what you mean by simple linear regression?
So what is illustrated on this slide is effectively the simplest case of linear regression, the case that we all start off with when we teach our courses. It's trying to understand the relationship between two different variables, which are nearly always written as y and x. So x here is it's called the independent variable, and y is called the dependent variable. It's not a symmetric relationship because the idea is to try to predict how well the variable x would predict the variable y. And when we say linear regression, that means we take a straight line fit and we essentially write the equation for a straight line in the form b0 plus b1x. b0 and b1 are numbers that if you gave me a data set, I would calculate those numbers from the data you gave me. One is called the intercept, the other one is called the slope. And then the final element of this equation is a random error, which is allowing for what happens in all realistic data sets, which is that there is some discrepancy from the linear relationship, which we generally refer to as a random error. So this is standard regression. This is not logistic regression. This is standard regression. So here is an example. It's taken from a book by Dietz et al., a standard book for introductory statistics. We use it in our courses in UNC, and the senior author of this book is a professor at Duke, so I'm assuming they probably use it at Duke as well. This data set illustrates it's the women's winning times from the New York Marathon over a 40-year period, 1978 to 2019. So if you just look, so each dot on that plot represents one race. On the bottom scale you see year, which indicates the year of the race. And on the left-hand side you see winning time minutes, which represents the actual time of the winner of the race for that particular year. So you just observing the data, it seems to be decreasing with time, which has the interpretation that women's running times are improving over the time. The straight line you see is the best fitting straight line by what is known as the method of least squares. And so let me just quickly talk through the table on the left-hand side. The first column of that table represents our estimates based on this data of B0 and B1. So let me just briefly try to interpret what B0 and B1 mean in this case. B1 is negative 0.1165. The interpretation of that is that over the course of this data, the women's winning times improved by approximately 0.1165, which is something about 6 or 7 seconds per year. And the 379, it's not very meaningful for this particular data set, but what it means is that if I could extrapolate those New York winning times all the way back to year 0, of course nobody was running marathons back at that time, but if I just extrapolated that straight line all the way back to year 0, the time would be 379. And then the other values in that table, the standard error, and we're going to hear more about standard errors later. The standard error is a standard measure of how variable the result is. So, for instance, with my slope of negative 0.1165, the standard error 0.024, that represents how uncertain I am about that estimate. If we want to test statistical significance, the standard technique is you take the estimate and you divide it by the standard error. That's called the t-value. And there are tables that you can use to convert the t-value to a p-value, which is the probability that you would have got. It's the same interpretation as I was just using with the 2x2 table. The p-value is the probability that you would see an estimate that is that extreme or more extreme if there was in fact no dependence in the data. And with B1 here, that would represent if there was really no trend, no improvement in women's performances, but this figure you see is just purely random error. The p-value associated with that hypothesis is 3.48 E minus 05, which is R's shorthand way of saying this is a number with 5 zeros followed by 348. The p-value for the intercept is also reported, but that's not particularly meaningful in this example. The conclusion is that the p-value is way, way, way below 0.05, so it's overwhelming evidence of a downward trend, or in other words, women's marathon times really have improved. It's not just an accidental association.
And just to clarify, Dr. Smith, when you say the p-values and you listed all of those zeros, those correspond on the chart to where it says E minus 0.5.
That's correct. Yes, that number 0.00000348. In R, we use the shorthand 3.48, and the E minus 05 means you stick 5 zeros in the front of 3.48.
All right. Just a few more questions about these this in theory. We've heard already some testimony about R squared. Can you tell us what R squared is in a linear regression?
It's a way of measuring how close the points in the data are to the straight line that we fitted to it. It's calculated as a ratio of variances. So what you see on the screen is the actual straight line fitted to this data. But if there was no slope in the straight line, then that straight line would just be a horizontal straight line. So what we do is we take the variance of the data points around the fitted straight line, and we divide it by the variance of the data points around the horizontal straight line, and we subtract that number from 1, and that's what we call R squared.
And does R squared tell you anything about unmeasured confounding?
No.
And can you explain the R square for these two pictures?
Well, the first example here illustrates the New York Marathon data I just referred to. R squared is 0.36, which is not a particularly high R squared, but it's not particularly low either. The interpretation is that although we have already seen there's a statistically significant linear trend, there's also a fair amount of variability about that trend. So in particular, if I wanted to use this curve to predict the winning time of next year's race, it would not give me a very precise estimate. It might be a starting value, but it would ignore other random features that affect the outcome of any particular race. The second one, it's a little bit of an artificial example, but I actually took it from the same book by Dietz et al. They took a sample of basketball players in the NBA, and they reported their height both in meters and in inches. Now, of course, there's an exact relationship between height measured in meters and height measured in inches, but there is some rounding error of the data, so the correlation isn't actually perfect. But when you compute the R squared value, it's 0.999. So that would be an example of, that would be the sort of the perfect example of a linear regression, but very few real-life examples actually look like that.
Now, Dr. Smith, we have heard that a logistic regression model was used by Michigan State. How does R square differ for logistic regression from linear regression?
So in logistic regression, the difference between logistic regression and what I was just talking about is that in logistic regression, each response variable is either a 0 or a 1. So it's not like the New York Marathon where we have a different time each year. Every response, every variable in the data set, the response is either 0 or 1. And in the statistical literature, there's no unified agreement on what corresponds to R squared in this case. Some people simply use the same algorithm as if it was continuous data, and they report that as R squared. That's not particularly appropriate because it doesn't reflect the nature of the data. There are other methods that are in the literature. There's something called Cohen's R squared. There's something else called the Cox-and-Snell R squared. There's Nagelkirk's R squared. Nagelkirk was a statistician who wrote about this in the early 1990s. So at UNC, I mentioned one of my courses is a course that covers, generalized linear models is a broad class of regression methods that include logistic regression. And one of the techniques I teach is how to do this. And I use a book by an author by the name of Julian Faraway, a book entitled Extending the Linear Model with R. And this is just an example from the book. He is trying to put CHD, in this case, is a 0-1 variable representing it's a sample of men who were followed for a number of years. CHD indicates whether or not they had coronary heart disease. That is represented over that period of time. That's represented as a function of a number of variables. Age, height is included in the data set. BMI, body mass index, SDP is systolic blood pressure, I think. Cholesterol, I'm not sure what DIBEP is. SIGS is the number of cigarettes. So in other words, a number of things that are known to be predictive of heart disease, and came up with a regression model. And the third line of code, this is just cut and pasted from the text, the third line of code there is actually computing this thing called Nagle-Kirk's R squared, and the answer comes out to be 0.143. Okay, so if you look at that number in comparison with the examples I was just talking about, you might be inclined to say, well, 0.143, that's closer to a 0 than 1. That doesn't seem to be a very impressive result. But Faraway goes on to explain this, where he says, well, it gives the impression of a fairly poor fit if you judge it from the experience of linear models. But he goes on to say, well, this is misleading because in the standard linear model, it's possible for the observed and fitted values to be very close. I mean, that example I presented with the basketball players, you saw the points were almost exactly on that straight line. Now, if the y values all had to be 0 or 1, it simply wouldn't be possible to fit a straight line through the whole lot and get an exact fit. So things like Nagle-Kirk's R squared and the other methods that are in the literature, they are sometimes quoted, and they can be a useful way of comparing one logistic regression model with another, but they really don't work as just a measure of is this a good quality model or not. And that is the conclusion that Faraway makes, is it may be best to avoid this statistic, except perhaps for the purpose of comparing compatible models.
All right. Just one more conceptual question before we turn to the details of your findings here. Can you walk through an example of logistic regression and how it would look in the statistical output?
So it's actually the same data set taken from the same book, but an earlier chapter in the book where he's trying to explain how logistic regression, well, it's actually the same chapter, but he does a simple example of it before he goes on to include all those variables like cholesterol and blood pressure. He said, suppose we tried to predict prevalence of heart disease just as a function of height and the number of cigarettes they smoke. So just intuitively from what we know about causal factors of heart disease, you might expect that the number of cigarettes would turn out to be a statistically significant variable. There's no obvious reason why height should be a significant variable. Now, what actually happens then if you fit the logistic regression, this table has a pretty similar interpretation to the table I showed you with the New York Marathon data. In this case, for historical reasons, people call it a z-value instead of a t-value. I could go into details why they explain why it's different, but I don't think we need that.
No.
The interpretation in this case is that the p-value for height is 0.338, and the p-value for cigarettes is of the order, well, e minus 0.08. It's approximately a 0.8 zeros and a 1. And so that confirms our intuition that with height, although there's a coefficient there, it's not statistically significant, but the coefficient due to cigarettes certainly is significant, and in the direction it's a positive coefficient, which means the more cigarettes you smoke, the more likely you are to get a heart attack.
All right, thank you. We're going to take our morning break at this time. 10 minutes, Sheriff.
We'll be recessed for 10 minutes.
They don't still have an office in Phillips Hall.
When I first moved to UNC, there was
independent approaches.
Yes.
Tell us about this first one.
So the first one, I decided I would just start with the Michigan State model and tweak it a bit, see if it was robust to a little bit of tweaking. And what I did, I picked out a few other variables that were not in their model, but seemed to me to be reasonable things that might be taken into account. So I think J accused stands for juror being accused of a crime. That was one thing that I think Dr. O'Brien talked about, but it didn't actually show up in their model. Helping is another thing we heard from Dr. O'Brien, whether somebody it works in one of the helping professions, such as nursing or teaching or something like that, and a bunch of other things that might be considered relevant. I expanded the model to 18 variables, and then I applied stepwise regression to reduce it back down to 11 variables. But maybe I should explain a little bit how we dealt with missing data, because this has already been come up in some of the testimony. It turns out if I just take those 18 variables and delete all the jurors who were missing at least one of those 18 variables, then my sample size is reduced to n is 1169, and that's a subset of the 1,700 plus jurors for whom they did the coding. We heard all from Dr. O'Brien about how they did the coding. There were about 1,700 jurors included in that study, but only 1,100 and something had values of all these 18 variables. But that was the data set that I used to do stepwise regression. I produced a set of 11 variables that were statistically significant. That set of variables, it has quite a lot of overlap with the Michigan State model, but it's not exactly the same. What I then did was to say, well, if I only care about those 11 variables, I don't need to worry about missing values in the other 7 variables that I dropped. And it turns out if you just look at those 11 variables, there are 1,679 individuals, jurors in the study for whom all those 11 variables are available. So the final model that I presented for this method includes all those individuals. And this is the data set. The list of variables is on the left-hand side. We've already talked about estimate, standard error, z-value, and p-value. The variable that says black has a p-value in this model of about 10 to the minus 10, which is a very, very highly statistically significant variable. In this sort of analysis, usually the smaller the p-value, the stronger the evidence of statistical significance. We ignore the intercept because the intercept's going to be in any model we fit. But next to that, the most extreme p-value is DP reservations. So I did find in my model, I did include DP reservations in the model, and indeed it came out to be very, very highly significant. But black was the second most significant variable as measured by either the p-value or the z-value. But you also see a few other things there that the things with an E minus something, J knew D, that means the juror knew the defendant. Lean's state, let me talk about Lean's state a second, just to, that refers to when the juror has expressed opinions that seem to be leading towards the state side of the case. That variable has a negative coefficient, which has the interpretation that a juror who expresses support for the state's case is less likely to be struck than one who expresses opinions the other side. So in fact, those coefficients on the left-hand side, all of them have the sign that you'd expect. As somebody who knows police, who works with the police or the prosecutors, that one also has a negative coefficient. Such a person is less likely to be struck from the jury. But no, with all those other variables there, the variable that says black is still extremely highly significant.
All right, now let's go to the next two models. And this slide, I think we can skip over because I think you already explained this process of how you dealt with
Well, what
imputed
I
data?
did for this analysis, we said, well, what happens if we expand it, not just take 18 variables, take all the variables in the study that seem to be relevant, but reduce the number to, numerous variables are not really usable for this type of analysis, but I concluded that 74 variables were usable, so I repeated the stepwise analysis, but starting from this expanded set of 74 variables instead of the 18 I was talking about a moment ago.
Okay. And what did you find when you used this model selection method?
So the first model was using backward selection, again using the AIC criterion. That's actually the less stringent of the two criteria, AIC or BIC. It usually results in a model with more variables in it than the BIC method. So we actually get 29 variables are included in this model, but I could highlight a few of them. The third row down on the left-hand side where it says black 1.00, that has a p-value of, well, it's not 10 to the minus 10 in this case, it's 10 to the minus 5, but that's still highly significant. If you go a few lines further down, you see DP reservations has a 10 to the minus 31. I think all the other variables I was just talking about are also statistically significant.
And
so, yeah.
No, I was just going to ask you about what happened with the BIC method.
Okay, so the BIC, I just said, it's a more stringent criterion. It usually throws out more of the variables. But again, what we did, we started from what I did was to start with the 74 variables and just let the computer run. It takes a little while to go through a stepwise regression with that many variables. But but everything, apart from the choice of the initial 74 variables, this was all a completely automated analysis using the inbuilt step function of R. And it produced another list of significant variables that again had a lot of overlap both with my first analysis and with the MSU analysis. In this case, I think there are 9 variables included. Is it 8 or 9? I'm not sure exactly. But again, black comes out statistically significant, in this case 10 to the minus 8. DP reservations, again, has a ridiculously small p-value, but the other ones that we also identified, JNU, the defendant, the juror leans towards the state, the juror leans towards the police case or has some connections with the police prosecution. All of those turned out to be very highly statistically significant, and the same sign, the coefficients of lean state and police pros are negative, as we'd expect. So the conclusion from that is that the analysis does indeed, the key points of the analysis, the ones that we actually care about, seem to be very robust against these different methods of going about the variable selection.
And indeed, when you look at the 4 methods, the 3 that you used and Michigan State's together for some of the most common variables of interest, what do you see?
So one way to express this is as the odds ratio, which we talked about yesterday. I won't try to define it again, or Dr. O'Brien talked about it. We estimate the odds ratio. I've picked out here the 5 variables that we identified in these analyses as the most significant variables, and just use the results of these logistic regressions to compute what the confidence interval is, a 95% confidence interval for each of those parameters. So, for instance, if we look at the variable black, the odds ratios 2.6, 2.7, 2.4, 2.4 again, they're all sort of in the same ballpark. But if you look at the 95% confidence intervals, that reflects the amount of uncertainty in each individual estimate. So for the MSU study, for instance, this is exactly in the table, the 95% confidence interval 1.931 to 3.513. Oh, I'm sorry, do you want to slow down a bit?
Yeah, 95%
confidence.
Okay, let me just repeat it just a little bit more slowly. If we look at the Michigan State analysis for black, the odds ratio they reported was 2.605, and the 95% confidence interval was 1.931 to 3.513. That was their analysis. The three analyses that I just told you about all produced odds ratios within their confidence interval, and my calculations of the confidence interval were pretty comparable with those that came out of Michigan State. And if you look at the other four variables in the table, DP reservations, JNUD, lean state, and police pros, you can see more or less the same thing. There's some variability in the odds ratios between one model and another, but if you compare them with the width of the confidence intervals, you can see that they're all estimating approximately the same thing.
And Dr. Smith, what does it tell you about the robustness of the strength of association between black and strike that there's so much agreement across these different methods of variable selection?
I think it allows us to conclude that the results are very robust against the method of variable selection, that we would not expect to get a different result if we used some different collection of variables, if we went through similar steps to process the data, like using stepwise regression and things like that.
And Dr. Smith, the next slide shows essentially the same thing, just reporting p-values instead of confidence intervals. Is that right?
That's correct, and I think I'm just taking a quick look at the table. I think everything there is less than 0.05. In nearly all cases, it's a lot less than 0.05. So that again confirms that these are statistically significant variables in all of the models fitted.
Now I want to turn to your last analysis of the odds ratio over time. What did you do to look at this question of whether, based on the MSU data, there was evidence of a relationship between black strikes and the strikes of black jurors at the time, specifically of Mr. Bacote's trial in 2009?
So it's possible to repeat any of the analyses that I've shown you with different subsets of the data. We could just analyze all the trials between 1995 and 2000, for example. That's a perfectly respectable way to do it. But what I wanted to do here was to come up with an estimate that would be applicable to April 2009, which was the time of Mr. Bacote's trial. So it wouldn't make sense just to look at other cases in April 2009 or even just within a couple of months either side, because if we just put too little data into the calculation, we would just not get sensible results out. The confidence intervals would be very wide and the estimates themselves would be unreliable. So we have to do something, I've called it a bandwidth, but this is a very common terminology in statistics for this kind of analysis. What it effectively means is whatever date we're interested in, let's expand it 2 years either side. I'll come back to it in a moment to why 2 years, but let's expand it to 2 years either side of that date and include all the cases that were tried within 2 years of that date. And I didn't do that analysis just for April 2009. What I actually did was to repeat that analysis, in fact, every 50 days all the way through the study. So if you take that thick black line there, that represents the odds ratios. And at any given date, I update it in increments of 50 days. I computed the odds ratio and the 95% confidence interval for that odds ratio using the same methods as we've already talked about, using these 2x2 tables and the confidence interval that comes out of Fisher's test. So then what we see here, what we're looking for is trends, see if there's some trend in the data. And what you can see, in fact, is that from the early 2000s, maybe from 2002 onwards, there does indeed seem to be a downward trend in the odds ratio, which I would interpret as meaning the prosecutors are less likely, as time goes on, they're less likely to use, whether implicitly or whatever, use race as a factor. But if you look at the value for 2009, which is the vertical line there just to mark April 2009 on that picture, you still see an odds ratio. I mean, the odds ratio is still above 2, and the confidence interval, if the confidence interval is above the value of 1, an odds ratio of 1 would mean no bias in the results. So from that, I conclude that there was still a statistically significant odds ratio in April 2009.
And Dr. Smith, you mentioned that you had looked at, you were going to come back to this question of bandwidth. Did you look at other periods of bandwidth for this smoothing technique? Yes.
There's a big literature on how to select the bandwidth in this kind of analysis, but the summary conclusion is there's no magic bullet. We just have to look at different bandwidths and see what the results are. I said already, if we had a bandwidth that was too small, we would get an uncertain estimate and a very wide confidence interval. But as we increase the bandwidth, we wouldn't want a bandwidth that was too big, because then we'd be effectively back to just including the whole of the data in one analysis. So this table shows the bandwidth for each of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. I show the odds ratio and the lower and upper bounds of the confidence interval and the associated p-value. So 2 years is the result I just showed you. The odds ratio was 2.26. with a confidence interval from 1.43 to 3.56, a p-value in that case of 0.0003. You can see in the table, if we start at the top, the confidence interval is wider, the p-value is bigger, but it's still well below 0.05. And as we go towards the bottom of the table, the values are gradually converging to something close to what we got in the full time period analysis. So based on that table, I'm saying, well, we don't want to be right at the top because the confidence intervals are too wide. We don't want to be right at the bottom because then we're not really capturing that time period. So I'm going for something in the middle, and I'm using 2 years as the bandwidth I used to calculate the previous figure.
And Dr. Smith, based on all of your analyses in this case, do you have an opinion as an expert statistician about whether race was statistically significant in the exercise of peremptory strikes in North Carolina at the time of Mr. Bacote's trial? Yes, I believe it was. Now, Dr. Smith, we heard from an expert yesterday in causal inference. Have you, in your professional experience, been part of a government committee that looked at causation and the role of this particular field of causal inference? Yes, I was asked to join a panel put together by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine. The National Academies regularly commissions research reports on topics of the public interest. This particular report was commissioned by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, who asked the National Academies to investigate what processes the EPA follows in assessing the causality of relationships between air pollution and health and welfare outcomes. Your Honor, may I approach the witness? Yes, sir. Yep, that looks like it. Yeah. Dr. Smith, I've handed you what's been marked as Defendant's Exhibit 105. Yes. Can you tell us what that is?
This is a PDF. It's on their website. You can download it. It's the PDF of the final report of the committee that I was just talking about. It's dated, I'm not sure whether it says the date on the front, but it's 2022. It came out at the end of 2022.
Your Honor, at this time we move for admission of Exhibit 105.
I'm sorry, do what?
We move for the admission of this exhibit, Defendant's Exhibit 105.
Tell me the relevance now.
I was just going to ask him about the... I'm sorry, Your Honor. I wanted to question Mr. Smith about what the approach of the EPA to considering causal questions, which is set out in this report that he was part of. There's going to be, he would, I believe, testify that about this weight of evidence approach, which is very similar to some of the topics that we've been hearing about from Dr. Mitra through the cross-examination of the state, of Dr. O'Brien as well, about convergence, this principle of convergence. He's not going to be testifying about the specifics of about air pollution in this case.
All right, I'll allow it, but get to that point, not anything else.
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Smith, as part of this committee, did you look at specifically at the role of causal inference in proving causation for
Yes.
the government?
Yes.
And what did the committee decide?
Well, to summarise it in a sentence or two, the EPA has long used an approach known as the weight of evidence approach, which essentially means they try to collect together all the studies that are relevant to whatever research question they're interested in, which is typically, as I said, the health effect of different air pollutants. In recent years, there's been a big explosion of interest in causal inference particularly over the last decade. So, in effect, the question was, well, should EPA sort of abandon its old approach and just use causal inference? And despite the fact that the committee here included some very well-known and well-established experts on causal inference, the overall conclusion was to support the EPA's weight of evidence approach. The committee acknowledged that causal inference could indeed add information to the study, but they did not recommend that EPA should change the overall strategy that it's used for the past 30 or 40 years.
And Dr. Smith, you've been here through the testimony, you've listened to this testimony about the topic of convergence of different kinds of studies. How does that relate to this concept of weight of evidence?
Well, I don't think the EPA actually uses the word convergence in the same sense as it was being used by Dr. O'Brien, but I believe it means essentially the same thing. I mean, there are thousands of studies each year published on air pollution and health. They go through, first they try to they remove things that are clearly irrelevant to the question of interest, and then they go through all the individual papers and try to assess how much each individual paper contributes to the overall picture. And essentially what Dr. O'Brien was calling convergence, I would simply call as agreement between different studies. If different studies done in different places with different populations using different research methods, if they come to broadly similar conclusions about air pollution and health, then we have a high level of confidence that the relationship is indeed causal.
Your Honor, at this time we would move for admission of Defendant's Exhibit 104, which was Dr. Smith's report, and 106, which were the copies of the slides from his testimony today.
All right. Who wants to go back to 105? court is going to reverse its decision and not allow that into evidence or it's heard a testimony. And so that is not allowed into evidence. It is not really relevant. I think the testimony is what is relevant as to the causal inference being used. Recognize that piece of evidence, but the report itself has nothing to do with what we're dealing with. So that is not allowed. 104 is what?
104, Your Honor, is Dr. Smith's report.
And 106, this is documents in his CV.
Your Honor, I believe I've already moved and the court's ruled that his CV was omitted. That was 103. Defendant's 106 are his slides.
So 106 is not his documentation of his CV? Where is it?
Your Honor, the CV was 103.
Which was a one-page document. This is 106.
Yes, which are his slides, the PowerPoint slides.
Okay, so it was the qualifications, honors, those type of things, and then the summary of his slides used as testimony. Right?
Yes, the 106 is an exact replica of the slides that he has been using throughout his testimony. They do refer to some of his, the initial slide had a couple of things that were on his CV, which was Defendant's Exhibit 103.
106 was allowed, if not previously, so and 104 is allowed. That's just a one-page. 103, excuse me. Now, what was 104?
104 is a copy of his report.
Okay. All right. All right, 104 is allowed. Anything else?
No, Your Honor.
All right. We've got a logistical question. We have 40 minutes before I leave. Do we even want to start across? Or do we want to, I assume you'll be an hour or more.
I believe it will take longer than 40 minutes, so if we want to start tomorrow.
I believe it will.
We have no objection.
So we are going to come back and finish the calls from this witness tomorrow.
Sure.
And then we will break until Monday. Does that give the state the additional time to do what it needs to do? Given that you have to make some changes in what you previously planned due to the absence of Mr. Wells?
It's what the court has ordered earlier, and we will do our best to do it, and we were not asking for any change to that earlier decision by your Honor.
So is there anything else that I can do to assist the state in making sure that what his absence how his absence has affected your ability to do everything you need to do? Anything else you can think of? Okay.
Nothing that I haven't already asked for, and I appreciate it, Your Honor.
Dr. Smith, come back tomorrow.
Okay, 9:30.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, recess us until, you have something else?
Well, since we had time, I was going to admit some exhibits. That's okay, we can do it later.
Well, we do have a minute or two. Let's do it. If you have some things that we can
Okay.
do. You can step down.
All right.
All right, what are they?
One is a letter that there's a stipulation, and it's something I intended to introduce with Ms. Kim. continued but failed to. It goes along with the, it's a discovery letter from the state that indicates, I'm sorry, that's the first copy. It's just that paragraph 3, it just shows that the state's list was provided in discovery and how, and what the state represented it to be. Pardon me? 350.
So that would be an October 29th, 2021 letter from the state, specifically Mr. Whitehouse to Ms. Stubbs, counsel for the defendant. Any objection by the state?
We've already stipulated to all the discovery letters, Your Honor.
Thank you. That is admitted.
And Your Honor, it's Exhibit 355, and I wrote on your copy 353. I apologize for that, but it's correct on the clerk's version.
Okay, so this is not 53, it's 355.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. That would be the October 29th, 2021 letter. Okay.
The next exhibit is what they are is census data and a summary chart. Census data the court can take judicial notice of. It's Exhibit 356.
Mr. Ferguson, may I ask a question?
Yes.
Have we already received that?
Yes.
Okay.
Just yesterday, the day before. If you need more time, that's fine.
No. But that's, that wasn't given over in discovery exhibit.
No.
Was this something that, okay.
It was given
Yesterday, correct?
Yes, after the issue came up on call, probably yesterday. I can wait.
Census of what?
There was some testimony about certain counties not being included in the report because there's no death penalty cases. And so I have the census data for the counties to show us a very small population of the state.
Your Honor, I'm not saying I object to it. I just like to look at it. So
Let's wait.
I can wait.
So give Mr. Fab, Ms. Jessica a copy.
They have copies.
They do?
Yes.
Mr. Perkins, I ask one more question. Can we approach?
Yes. I do want to reprint.
Do we have a copy of that?
Yes.
Do we still have that?
Oh, there it is.
Yeah. I want to look at it.
Okay.
All right, census data number 356 is not admitted at this time. However, it will be considered by the defendant as to any possible objections that we'll talk about at a later time. Anything else? Anything else from the state? Recess us until 9:30 in the morning.
All rise. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. It's on Spirit Court of the County of Johnston being recessed to 9:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. May God save the state of on Spirit Court.
No, those are my notes. And the other two. It was, with all the slides, we'll see.